Kansas didn't know it was being hunted. One man moved through quiet streets, watching and choosing. He called himself BTK. He came prepared. Restraints, bags, tools of control. What followed was suffering, then silence. For nearly 30 years, he evaded police, returning only to remind them he remained. Wichita was finally hearing the killer himself, not rumor or theory. The voice behind decades of fear was answering questions left open for 30 years. This was a city of routine, church on Sundays, storm sirens in spring. In 1974, that comfort collapsed. The danger wasn't distant. It was here, reshaping the city's sense of safety for decades. Inside the house, detectives were confronted with a crime scene that would stay with them for the rest of their careers. The Otero family had only recently moved into the quiet neighborhood. The intruder strangled the father, Joe, then his wife, Julie. He turned next to their 9-year-old son, Joey. Evidence showed the child was slowly suffocated, a bag placed over his head, while the killer sat nearby and watched. Believing the parents and the boy were dead, he took 11-year-old Josephine to the basement and hanged her. The murders of the Otero family marked the beginning of a series that would terrorize Wichita for decades and remain unexplained until the killer finally spoke 30 years later. Dennis Rader was born in 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and raised largely in Wichita. He was the oldest of 4 boys, and on the surface, his childhood drew little attention. His mother worked at a grocery store. His father worked for the railroad. Neighbors described the family as quiet and decent. Rader was reserved, rarely stood out, but remained present, never leading, never disappearing. He fit in, though always slightly at the edges. Beneath that ordinary exterior, however, disturbing thoughts were already taking shape. Rader would later admit to cruelty toward animals and an early fixation on women's clothing. None of it was visible at the time, but both would become significant markers in the path he followed. Looking back, investigators would identify one childhood memory in particular as a moment that may have helped shape the violent sexual fantasies that later defined him. By his early teens, power, control, and sexual arousal were no longer separate in Dennis Rader's mind. They were beginning to fuse. Outwardly, he appeared ordinary, growing up in a quiet Wichita neighborhood with little to draw attention. Inwardly, something darker was forming. By 8th or 9th grade, he later admitted he was experiencing urges he knew set him apart, and believed even then that his future was already taking shape. After high school, Rader joined the U.S. Air Force, serving 4 years as a mechanic before returning to Kansas. He settled in Park City and married in 1971, presenting a stable public life. Privately, his fantasies deepened. He hid them carefully, consumed violent detective magazines, and recorded his inner world through detailed drawings no one else was meant to see. Rader later referred to this drive as Factor X. What he was describing was a deviant pattern of sexual arousal rooted in domination, humiliation, and violence. He studied other serial killers, not out of curiosity, but instruction, learning how they operated and how they were caught. By January 15, 1974, his fantasies crossed into reality with the murders of the Otero family. It would take more than 30 years before Wichita heard the full account, delivered directly by Dennis Rader himself in chilling courtroom testimony. After the murders, Rader returned home as if nothing had happened. His wife was due back from work, and he wanted to be there to greet her. Later, he would describe how close he came to exposure. One morning, while reading a newspaper article about BTK at the breakfast table, his wife noticed a misspelled word and casually pointed out that the killer spelled it the same way he did. Rader later said that in that moment, he believed he might have to kill her. When she said nothing more, he let it pass. As Wichita struggled to process the slaughter of the Otero family, Rader was already watching for his next victim. He soon noticed 21-year-old Kathy Bright collecting mail outside her home on East 13th Street. A Wichita State University student, Kathy had returned home that day with her brother Kevin. What neither of them knew was that BTK was already inside the house, waiting. Rader had not expected Kevin to be there. Kevin managed to break free. He stood up and began screaming. Rader came out and shot him in the head. Believing Kevin was dead, Rader turned his attention back to Kathy. The restraints failed, and the struggle escalated. He stabbed her multiple times, killing her. Kevin later regained consciousness. Disoriented but alive, he stumbled out the front door, screaming for help. Despite planning the attack in advance, Rader had arrived unprepared. He had failed to bring all of the bindings he normally relied on. Looking back at his earliest murders, investigators would later note how close he came to being caught. He made mistakes. He rushed. He believed there had been a witness and feared he had left evidence behind. For a brief moment, Rader was convinced his crimes were already unraveling. Not long after Kathy Bright's murder, news reports surfaced claiming that 3 other men had been implicated in the Otero killings. For Rader, that was intolerable. He needed recognition. That frustration triggered his first direct contact with police, a letter. In it, he made his intentions clear. This was not over. If he wasn't stopped, more people would die. Then, just as suddenly, he went silent. It would be 3 years before he killed again. Because of the time gap since the previous murders, investigators did not immediately link Shirley Vian's killing to the earlier cases. Part of that distance was intentional. By this point, Rader had become a father, first to a son and later to a daughter. He learned to divide his life cleanly. At home, he played the role of a devoted parent. Elsewhere, he continued to kill. 9 months later, in December 1977, he struck again, an attack he would later describe as his perfect murder. In this phase, Rader focused on control and delay. He would bring the victim close to death, then ease off, allowing her to regain consciousness before tightening the ligature again. The suffering was deliberate. For Rader, prolonged fear and pain was inseparable from sexual gratification. He believed this method gave him complete dominance over another person. Afterward, convinced he had executed the crime exactly as intended, Rader took an extraordinary step. The following day, he called police from a payphone, reported the homicide himself, and provided the address, ensuring credit for the killing belonged to him alone. Officers moved quickly, and what they discovered confirmed their worst fear. BTK had returned, and Wichita was again facing a serial killer. On February 10, 1978, 2 months after the murder of Nancy Fox, local station KAKE received a letter. It was from BTK. He claimed responsibility for the Otero family, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, and another unnamed victim. Enclosed was a poem titled, "Oh, Death to Nancy," along with a drawing of Fox lying dead on her bed. Rader was now getting exactly what he wanted: attention, status, and control. Taunting police became part of the crime itself, a way to prove he couldn't be caught. The letters continued. Police remained without answers, and Wichita lived in constant uncertainty. Then, after nearly 4 years of fear, BTK vanished. But the silence was deceptive. After 7 murders, Rader studied criminal justice, not to change, but to sharpen his methods. Rader treated potential victims as assignments. He watched, evaluated, planned. Every detail mattered. Entry points, timing, escape. He obsessed over leaving no trace. He carried a kit with him: restraints, bags, tape, weapons. Everything was deliberate. Yet despite the planning, his victim selection appeared random. Ordinary people, chosen simply because they were available. Rader described it as hunting. He could be driving through his own neighborhood, see a woman walking, sitting on a porch, or stepping inside her home, and decide in that moment she was the one. For his next victim, he didn't have to look far. She lived just 4 houses away. On the night Maureen Hedge was killed, Rader had already prepared his cover. He took his son to a Boy Scout camp, then left in the early hours of the morning. He murdered Maureen Hedge and returned to the campsite as if nothing had happened. Maureen Hedge was a church deacon. After killing her, Rader posed her body and photographed it. In the images, choir robes were visible in the background, making it clear the photos were taken inside a church. 9 days later, her body was found in a ditch, badly decomposed. Nearby, police discovered knotted pantyhose. Rader's role as a Boy Scout leader repeatedly gave him cover. It allowed him to leave home without suspicion. On some occasions, he used that freedom to engage in autoerotic acts, photographing himself in bondage, sometimes buried in shallow graves, wearing women's clothing. There were moments he later admitted he feared he would be found and exposed. It was part of the double life he carefully maintained. After the murder of Maureen Hedge, the killings continued. The next would come in 1986, when Rader broke into a home and waited for Vicki Wegerle to return from shopping with her baby. He restrained her, tortured her, and left her bound on the bed. When her husband returned home that afternoon, he cut her loose, believing she might still be alive. She wasn't. 4 years later, in 1991, Rader killed again. This time, his victim was 62-year-old Dolores Davis. Once again, Wichita waited for another attack, but none came. Investigators wondered if BTK had been caught for some unrelated crime. He hadn't. Rader was still there, blending into the community. Instead of killing, he collected trophies from past crimes, storing them in a treehouse behind his home alongside detective magazines and fantasy material. As his children grew up, he changed jobs, becoming a compliance officer, a position that gave him authority and cover. Over time, the city slowly returned to normal. A new generation grew up untouched by fear. Then, in 2004, 30 years after the Otero murders, BTK resurfaced. The terror returned instantly. After vanishing for 13 years, he came back for one reason: attention. After decades of silence, BTK had returned, and this time he wanted attention. He began taunting police and media with games. He sent officers on scavenger hunts across Wichita, leaving behind cereal boxes filled with posed dolls and personal items taken from his victims. Each drop came with clues, carefully designed to draw focus back to him. But the behavior also revealed something else. He was growing careless. With every message, investigators learned more. And then BTK made a critical error, one that showed how little he understood modern technology. It was the opening law enforcement had been waiting for. The disc BTK sent was assigned to Randy Stone, a detective with the Forensic Computer Crimes Unit. His job was simple: extract whatever information the killer believed he had hidden, and see if this time BTK had finally handed police his identity. The disc led investigators straight to Dennis Rader. He was the president of Christ Lutheran Church in North Wichita. On February 25, 2005, police arrested him. Once in custody, Rader didn't resist. He acknowledged what police already knew: BTK was finally in hand. After his arrest, Rader confessed in detail. Over the next 2 days, he spoke for 33 hours, laying out his crimes piece by piece. For the Wichita Police Department, it was time to reveal the identity of the man who had terrorized the city for more than 3 decades. Because Dennis Rader pleaded guilty, there was no trial. Instead, a plea hearing was held to place the full record of evidence on the record. He received 10 consecutive life sentences, at least 175 years in prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum punishment available at the time for his crimes. The BTK case later became the basis for multiple portrayals, including Netflix's Mindhunter, Stephen King's novella A Good Marriage, and the 2025 Netflix documentary, My Father, the BTK Killer. If you have thoughts on this case, share them in the comments and subscribe for more in-depth crime documentaries like this one.